Hello, my name is Dr. Jacob Gran, and in this video we are going to learn how to combine what we've learned so far in the video series, and to compose rhythmically free counter melodies over a given melody. This type of counterpoint exercise is traditionally referred to as Florid counterpoint, since we are now allowed to make use of every kind of rhythmic proportion and all three kinds of voice-leading dissonance. The first thing to know is that we are going to compose our melodies in quadruple meter. That is to say, there will be 4 quarter note beats for each whole note of the given melody. These beats have the same metrical properties as they did in our 4-to-1 exercises, in terms of which ones are strong and which are weak. Instead of trying to remember all of the rules about what can happen on each beat, try thinking of it instead in terms of the rules for the kinds of voice-leading dissonances. Dissonant passing tones can occur at the half note level on beat 3, or at the quarter note level on beats 2, 3, or 4. Dissonant neighbor notes can occur as quarter notes on beats 2 or 3, and the dissonant suspension can occur on beat 1, as long as it is resolved on beat 3, and prepared as a consonance on beat 3 of the previous measure. The dissonant suspensions in our Florid melodies are allowed to be elaborated in various ways that will make them more rhythmically interesting. Take this 7-6 suspension as an example. The note E is prepared on beat 3 of the first measure. We get the dissonant suspension itself on beats 1 and 2 of the second measure, and then it resolves down by step to a consonant D on beat 3. All of the suspension elaborations that I'm going to show you occur on beat 2 of the second measure, in between the dissonance and the resolution. None of the elaborations should be mistaken for resolutions of the dissonance. The first 2 examples involve tone repetitions. We may re-articulate the dissonant tone on beat 2, or we may anticipate the tone of resolution. We can also include an embellishing tone by leaping to an inner voice chord member. I especially like this one because of the richness of that delayed resolution, and the way that the 2 leaps can influence the shape of the melody. We can also include a sort of escape tone by stepping up from the dissonance before leaping down to the resolution. It is kind of difficult to make this one sound smooth, and it's somewhat rare. There are also 2 eighth note elaborations involving neighbor note motion above the dissonant tone in the first case, and below the tone of resolution in the second. The lower eighth note elaboration is especially common. The only other way to include eighth note motion in our exercises is through an eighth note fill. In this example, we see a half note E on beats 1 and 2 that leaps upward by a perfect fourth to an A on beat 3. If we were to try to fill in that leap of a fourth with stepwise motion, we would need 2 new notes, F and G. And we can do that as long as we give them both eighth note durations. These kinds of eighth notes must fill in the span of a fourth, either ascending or descending, and must occur on the weak beats, either beat 2 like here, or beat 4. It doesn't matter if either of the eighth notes are consonant or dissonant, since they are fulfilling a passing motion function, just like the passing tones that filled in the span of a third that we learned about in our 2-to-1 exercises. In the interest of rhythmic variety, we are also allowed to use dotted half note values on the first beat of each measure, such as in this example. You should think of them like a variation on a 2-to-1 relationship, so anything that is permissible with 2 consecutive half notes, like in our 2-to-1 exercises, can be done now with a dotted half note and a quarter. It's difficult to generalize too much, but there are some general guidelines about how to organize the distribution of rhythms in our exercises. Felix Salzer gives us a deliberate example of what not to do. In this example, it is very obvious that the first three measures are written mechanically in a 2-to-1 proportion. The next two are in 4-to-1, and the last few measures are suspensions. This exercise follows all of the rules for each rhythmic proportion, but it still doesn't make for a very good Florid melody. The sudden gear shifts from half-note motion to quarter-note motion and back sound abrupt and unmotivated. We want our melody to sound as if it could speed up or slow down naturally at any moment, so we want the rhythms to be blended. When the melody does change speed, we want the change to feel responsive to the shape and energy of the melody. The musicologist Knud Jeppesen gives this melody by Palestrina as an example of a natural rhythmic arc. Just like Salzer's exercise, the melody starts with slower note values, speeds up near the middle, and then slows down again. But unlike the exercise, Palestrina's melody is rhythmically blended. Jeppesen is trying to make a point only about Palestrina's style, but the idea of a rhythmic arc for melodic organization applies to all sorts of music, including, for example, many of the solos of Miles Davis. When the melody is in a state of low energy, like at the beginning of our exercises, it tends to move in slower note values. This is a smart opening strategy because you deliberately leave yourself room to grow for the rest of the melody. In order to reach our high point, we need to create a sense of growing tension as we ascend, and this is usually accomplished by faster note values. Often the notes of the high point are also given in slower note values, like the pregnant pause at the top of the hill of a roller coaster. There's a sense that the kinetic energy of the faster note values during the ascent has been converted into potential energy. That potential energy is released as we accelerate during the descent, and the melody slows down again near the end to give a sense of gliding into the cadence. Fuchs gives one more important piece of advice for composing Florid melodies, and that is to work from a fourth species basis. That means to include as many consonant and dissonant suspensions in our melody as possible. There's no such thing as too many suspensions. Here's Beethoven's fourth species exercise that we looked at in the previous video. Notice that the syncopated, tied half notes create an equality of rhythmic interest between the two voices. Compare that to a 4-to-1 exercise, where the quarter note melody demands a greater amount of the listener's attention, so that the counterpoint dominates the Cantus Firmus. On each of the downbeats of Beethoven's exercise, the only thing to pay attention to is the motion of the Cantus Firmus. Then the counterpoint melody fills in the gaps on the offbeats. We could make a pretty good Florid melody simply by taking this suspension exercise and decorating it with faster note values to create a rhythmic arc, and peppering in some of those suspension elaborations that we talked about earlier. Here is Fuchs's example of a Florid melody written above his Dorian Cantus Firmus. And here is the same melody rewritten as an analytic diagram. The suspension elaborations here and here don't get harmonic intervals, since they are only there for decoration, and we want to emphasize the distant voice-leading connection between the downbeat dissonances and their resolutions. We could perform another level of rhythmic reduction, stripping away all of the inessential dissonances, and be left with an even simpler melodic skeleton that still sounds quite a bit like the Florid melody. Here are 4 other examples of Florid melodies composed throughout history based on the same Cantus Firmus. Mozart's and Schenker's are really not that different from Fuchs's melody. The one by Bellarmine is in 3/2 time, and it gives a good example of how to apply the same rules of Florid counterpoint to a triple meter context. The last one by Jeppesen is very different from the others. It has fewer suspensions, but it also has a more dramatic rhythmic arc than the others. Now let's walk through how to compose a Florid melody over a Cantus Firmus. I'll use the same given melody by Fétis that I used for the walkthrough back in the video on 1-to-1 counterpoint. We can start by composing in a suspension cadence. Like I mentioned earlier, we want to work from a 4th species basis, and the 7/6 suspension cadence is definitely the best of the cadential formulas that we have at our disposal. Next, we can plan out our high point. I like this option. The high point G is approached in overall contrary motion to the descending given melody, and it occurs 2 measures after the given melody's high point on A, so that the 2 high points are offset from one another. But of course, these whole notes are very boring, so let's try to elaborate this basic shape with some suspensions. So far, so good. Now let's plan out how to fill in this short gap between F and C. This is the part of our rhythmic arc where we would like to have some faster note values as we give a sense of accelerating as we descend. So I came up with this. Between the 2 downbeats, we have a 1/6 between F and D, moving by quarter note stepwise motion to a 1/3 between E and G. Now let's turn our attention to the beginning of the exercise and pick some starting notes to counterpoint against this opening segment of the Cantus Firmus. Starting on scale degree 5 will give our melody room to grow as it descends upwards, but there are plenty of other solutions at this point. You may recall that this is the same whole note beginning that I chose for our 1-to-1 exercise from the first video. We can syncopate this counter melody to create a little more rhythmic interest, like this. Now, as I look at the remaining segment and wonder how to fill in this rather large gap, I'm struck by the descending stepwise portion of the Cantus Firmus here. If possible, it would be nice to compose a counter melody that moves in overall contrary motion. In this case, that means I'm looking for a solution that ascends upwards stepwise. I came up with this. We can start on an E, and by leaping down to a unison G on the upbeat of this measure, we can ascend smoothly in half notes in contrary motion. But this creates a problem. In this measure, we now have to repeat the tone C in half notes in order to prepare the consonant suspension that I had composed earlier. That type of note repetition within a measure is very poor. Luckily, there's an easy solution to this. By composing in a quarter note embellishing tone on beat 2, we can prolong the note C through the entire measure, so that it can be a point of melodic arrival on beat 1 and also serve as a preparation for the suspension on beat 3. Remember this trick, it comes in handy pretty often. Now there's only a small gap remaining between G and E in the counterpoint melody. We can fill in this gap very easily using C as a consonant suspension. Here we've composed the skeleton of our Florid melody with a nice beginning, middle, and end, and plenty of consonant and dissonant suspensions. At this point, though, we don't have very much of a rhythmic arc, and it looks more like a 4th species exercise than a Florid melody. Before we go in and elaborate the melody with faster note values, let's listen to just the melodic skeleton. We want to create a more natural rhythmic arc by adding faster note values somewhere around this area of the melody. That way, the beginning will still sound like it is at rest, and we will create the impression that climbing up to the high point requires some work and effort. There are lots of ways to do that, but I like this option. The half notes of this portion of the melody have been replaced with quarter notes that exaggerate the ascending contrary motion, and the leap from E to a unison G has been substituted by a larger leap of an octave from E to a low E, creating a brief voice crossing, and again exaggerating the same basic shape. Another easy place to include quarter notes to create more rhythmic interest would be here, here, and here, where we can insert dissonant passing tones to fill in what would otherwise be leaps of a third. I'd also like to add a little bit of eighth note motion for variety. One way to do that would be to add eighth note elaborations to our dissonant suspensions, like in the examples from the first part of the video. I like instead to use some eighth note fills here and here to fill in what would otherwise be leaps of a fourth. But now that I've filled in those leaps, I'm starting to realize that the only dramatic leap in our counterpoint melody is this octave leap pretty early on, and then the rest of the tune is pretty much entirely stepwise. That's why I'm going to include an embellishing tone elaboration to this dissonant suspension. Technically, this embellishing tone creates a leap of a dissonant descending seventh, which I know I'm not supposed to do. But overall, I think the improvement of the melodic line justifies breaking the rule in this case. You will sometimes see these kinds of passages labeled licenza, indicating that we have taken an artistic license. I'm allowed to depart from strict counterpoint and to dip a little bit into free counterpoint because it's my video and no one can stop me. But I wouldn't recommend doing this on your homework. Here are two Cantus Firmi by Knud Jeppesen, the first in C major and the other in D Dorian. Compose 4 Florid melodies, one above and one below each of these Cantus Firmi. If you want to be thorough, you can then create analytic diagrams of your melody to show that you understand all of the underlying compositional relationships. Stay tuned for the next video when we will discuss invertible counterpoint.